Since its founding, the United States grappled with the issue of slavery. For the next 80 years since it first declared that all men are created equal, the nation's politicians argued, debated, and even came to blows with each other over the future of slavery as the nation developed and expanded westward. As a result, the fight to preserve slavery, or to abolish it outright, threatened to fracture the Union and erupt into the Civil War. Part 1. Slavery in the New Republic. Slavery was a fact of life in Britain's North American colonies. By the time of the American Revolution, about 460,000 African Americans were enslaved, making up 20% of the total population. Most lived in the South, especially in Virginia and South Carolina, where they worked on large plantations growing crops like tobacco, indigo, rice, and wheat. The wealth from these plantations created a wealthy elite class of Southern aristocracy, or planters. Only 10% of the enslaved people lived in the North, working on small farms or in cities in New York and New England. The American Revolution highlighted the conflict between the fight for freedom and the reality of slavery. Leaders such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison owned slaves. Jefferson himself wrote "All men are created equal" in the Declaration of Independence, even though he owned hundreds of slaves. This inherent contradiction in America's founding values forced some states to take action. In 1774, Rhode Island and Connecticut limited the slave trade, while northern states like Vermont and Pennsylvania moved towards ending slavery. By the turn of the century, most northern states had outlawed slavery, resulting in the local free black population growing. Pennsylvania, for example, passed a law in 1780 freeing anyone born after that year by age 28. In 1782, Virginia allowed slave owners to free their slaves. The height of the early abolition movement came with the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which banned slavery north of the Ohio River. That year, representatives from all states met in Philadelphia to create the U.S. Constitution. A major debate centered on slavery. When it came time to discuss how states should be equally represented in Congress, problems arose. Southern states wanted their enslaved people counted as part of the population to gain more seats in Congress. Northern states opposed this because it would give the South too much power. The delegates came to an agreement with the 3/5 Compromise, where each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of the person for taxes and representation. Another argument focused on the slave trade. As mentioned before, some states had already limited it, but southern states, especially South Carolina and Georgia, wanted it to stay legal to protect their economies. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society, a Quaker-based anti-slavery group, urged Benjamin Franklin to suggest a ban. Franklin, however, stayed silent, worried it would upset the South. The final agreement allowed the slave trade to continue until 1808. By the time the Constitution was ratified in 1788, America's stance on slavery was clear. The Constitution prioritized property rights over human rights and liberty, ensuring that slavery remained a part of the nation. To some, the year 1808 could not come soon enough. In 1790, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and their fellow Quakers in New York urged Congress to stop the slave trade. However, strong resistance from the southern states slowed progress. When news of a massive slave revolt in French Haiti broke out, Congress rushed to do something about the trade. In 1794, Congress banned foreign slavers from using U.S. ports. Congress hoped this would prevent similar uprisings in America. In the meantime, more and more enslaved people fled plantations, and more refugees from Haiti entered the U.S. These escapes kept alive fears of rebellion. The Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution allowed slave owners to capture their escaped slaves anywhere in the country, but the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act gave the clause greater legal backing. The act required that captured slaves be brought in front of a state or federal judge, and even then, the slaves did not face a proper trial by a jury, and their owner only needed to orally confirm that the slave was indeed theirs. Though this law was hard to enforce, it was nonetheless a federal law, and to abolitionists, it was a sign of the country's support for slavery. In 1807, Congress banned the African slave trade, with the law taking effect in 1808 as soon as the Constitution allowed it to. Violators faced fines and jail time, but enforcement was weak. Many ship owners and traders ignored the ban and continued smuggling enslaved people. Many in the North believed ending the slave trade would eventually end slavery in America. They thought the white population would grow faster than the black population. As population increases, Chief Justice Oliver Ellsworth believed, poor laborers will be so plenty as to render slaves useless. Slavery in time will not be a speck in our country. But they misunderstood how slavery worked in the U.S. Unlike in the Caribbean and South America, where many enslaved people died due to disease and harsh conditions, and so more and more were brought in from Africa, the enslaved population in North America grew naturally, nearly doubling every 20 to 25 years. In places like Virginia and Maryland, population growth meant fewer imports were needed. Maryland began selling enslaved people, while Virginia sold or moved them west, spreading slavery into new areas like Kentucky and Tennessee. In South Carolina, some planters grew cotton, a profitable crop used for clothing. However, it was hard to grow and harvest because removing seeds by hand was a very, very slow process. This changed in 1793 when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Gin being short for engine, the machine required the labor of one man to turn it, and with which one man will clean 10 times as much cotton as he can in any other way before now, and also cleanse it much better than in the usual mode. By 1805, annual cotton production in the South skyrocketed from 2 million pounds to 60 million. Cotton's massive success created a huge demand for slave labor. Plantations expanded from South Carolina and Georgia deeper into the southeast. Mississippi and Louisiana became major centers for cotton and sugar production. By the time Louisiana became a state in 1812, slavery was firmly entrenched in the southeast. The hope that slavery would fade away was gone. King Cotton would dominate the American economy and ensure slavery's survival for the next 5 decades. Part 2. A Bid for Freedom. In 1800, the fears of slave revolt among Virginia's planters almost came true. Gabriel, an enslaved blacksmith in Virginia, led a plan to rebel and end slavery. He aimed to attack Richmond, seize weapons, and rally support from poor whites. Unfortunately for Gabriel, heavy rain and betrayal stopped the rebellion. Gabriel and 26 others were executed. In response, Virginia and other southern states tightened their laws. Virginia repealed their law allowing the freeing of slaves and forced free black people to leave the state. Maryland, Kentucky, and Delaware then refused to let the expelled freedmen settle there. In 1822, Denmark Vesey, a free black carpenter in Charleston, South Carolina, planned another revolt. Vesey, born in the Danish West Indies, had once been enslaved but gained freedom through a lottery. Inspired by the Haitian Revolution and the Bible, Vesey organized a rebellion on Bastille Day to free slaves, seize weapons, and overthrow Charleston's authorities. Informants exposed the plan, and authorities stopped it before it began. Vesey and 34 others were executed, and many more were exiled or jailed. After Vesey's plot, South Carolina enacted harsher rules, much like Virginia. Free black sailors were jailed while in Charleston's port, and Vesey's African Methodist Episcopal Church faced restrictions, accused of promoting resistance among enslaved people. In August 1831, Nat Turner, an enslaved man and religious leader, led the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. Turner believed God chose him to fight for freedom. A solar eclipse in February strengthened his conviction. On August 21st, he and his followers began the revolt in Southampton County, Virginia, killing their masters, along with their women and children, as they moved from farm to farm. About 60 people joined the rebellion, including enslaved and free black men. Over the course of 2 days, they killed 57 white people. Some enslaved people refused to join, and some protected their masters. The uprising ended when militia and federal troops crushed the group. Turner hid for 6 weeks, but was captured, tried, and executed. In the search for Turner, angry white mobs killed scores of innocent black people, many of whom had no connection to Turner at all. Virginia once again responded with stricter laws limiting black education, movement, and gatherings. A brief debate on ending slavery followed, but brought no change. Some Virginia politicians suggested colonization to prevent future slave revolts. This idea was not new. In 1816, Paul Cuffe, a sea captain of African and Wampanoag descent, sailed to West Africa with supplies and 38 African Americans hoping for better lives. Cuffe wanted to promote Christianity, oppose slavery, and encourage more immigration to Africa. He passed away in 1817, but his idea continued. The American Colonization Society, founded by white supporters, aimed to resettle free black people in Africa. They hoped this would reduce racial tensions and slavery's impact by removing black people from the U.S. With government help, the ACS established the colony of Liberia in 1821. Despite disease and hardships, over 4,000 African Americans migrated there by 1843. Some politicians, like Secretary of State Henry Clay, were supporters of the ACS and believed colonization could gradually end slavery and ease white fears of free black communities. However, by the 1850s, colonization lost support as Liberia declared independence in 1847. The abolition of slavery in Canada drew many free and fugitive slaves there instead of Africa. Colonizing Africa did not stop new slave revolts as Virginia had hoped. Another revolt was led by Singbe Pie, later called Joseph Cinque, a 25-year-old farmer from Sierra Leone. In 1839, slave traders captured him and sold him into slavery. He ended up on a Portuguese slave ship, the Tacora, where he, like so many other Africans, endured brutal and cramped conditions in the Middle Passage. Although Spain outlawed the Atlantic slave trade, the Tacora smugglers forged documents to pass their enslaved Africans off as being born in Cuba. Cinque and others were sold to plantation owners and put on the ship La Amistad to be transported to Cuba. During the voyage, Cinque led a revolt, freeing the captives and taking control of the ship. They ordered the remaining crew to sail to Africa, but the crew tricked them and steered toward the US. The US Navy captured La Amistad near Long Island, and the Africans were jailed in Connecticut. Spain demanded their return, but abolitionists argued that they were kidnapped and fought for their freedom. In 1841, the US Supreme Court ruled that Cinque and the others were free. Some, including Cinque, returned to Africa, but found their homeland ravaged by war. Nonetheless, the case became a symbol in America of the fight against slavery. As mentioned before, many African Americans seeking a better life moved to Canada. For fugitive slaves escaping to freedom, their journey to the north or to Canada was dangerous and required traveling the Underground Railroad. This secret network, run by abolitionists, helped guide, shelter, and protect fugitives. They used hidden stations and conductors to move people at night to avoid capture. Routes often followed rivers, mountains, or the North Star for guidance. The Underground Railroad openly defied laws like the Fugitive Slave Act, increasing tensions between the North and South. Many fugitives escaped through personal courage and help from other black people. They wore disguises, carried stolen supplies, and sometimes pretended to be free to evade capture. If they chose to follow the conductors, they were hid in barns, attics, or wagons. Stations were usually 10 to 20 miles apart, giving fugitives a chance to rest before continuing their journey north. Both black and white allies risked their lives to help. Harriet Tubman, an escaped slave, led over 300 people to freedom. Levi Coffin, a white Quaker, helped thousands, and others, like John Fairfield and John Parker, used disguises to free slaves. By 1860, the Underground Railroad had helped tens of thousands escape to freedom. Part 3. Westward Expansion and Sectionalism. In 1803, the U.S. bought the Louisiana Territory, opening vast tracts of land for settlement, but also creating space for slavery to spread. By 1816, the Union had 10 free states in the North, where slavery was banned, and 9 slave states in the South, where it was allowed. This created an issue where the North had a bit more power than the South. Through the coming decades, Congress worked to keep the balance of power between the states. By 1819, Missouri had enough settlers to apply to become a state. Its settlers wanted slavery, and if Missouri was admitted as a slave state, the South would have more power. Congressman James Tallmadge proposed that, as a condition for admittance, Missouri should ban new slaves and free all enslaved children born there at age 25. This caused heated debates between the North and South. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise, brokered by Northern Senator Jesse Thomas, settled the issue for a time. Missouri became a slave state, and Maine, split from Massachusetts, entered the Union as a free state. The compromise also banned slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of Missouri's southern border at 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel. In the long run, the compromise did not end its tensions. The sectional issue of slavery now firmly divided the North and South. Over the coming decades, the South would cling to slavery to keep political power, as the North's population grew. This sectionalism was the death knell of the Republic, as an elderly Thomas Jefferson put it. The next major divide came in 1828. That year, Northern lawmakers passed the Tariff of 1828 to protect American factories from European competition. The North supported it, as it boosted their growing industries. The South, however, hated it, calling it the Tariff of Abominations. Wealthy Southern planters, who relied on selling cotton and rice, said it hurt crop demand, and therefore slavery. Vice President John C. Calhoun opposed the tariff. He argued it was unconstitutional because it helped one region, the North, over another, the South. In his South Carolina Exposition and Protest, he claimed states could nullify and reject any federal laws they found unfair or unconstitutional. Calhoun believed the states, not the federal government, had the ultimate power to decide what was constitutional. In 1832, Congress passed a revised tariff, but South Carolina still refused to accept it. The state declared both the 1828 and 1832 tariffs illegal and threatened to secede from the Union if they were forced to accept the tariffs. President Andrew Jackson stood firm, calling nullification illegal and secession treasonous. Congress passed the Force Bill, allowing Jackson to use military force to enforce the law. With the rest of the southern states not supporting South Carolina gave in. The nullification crisis deepened divides in the nation and showed just how far some would go to defend slavery and states' rights. In the meantime, abolitionists sent anti-slavery petitions demanding change, exercising their First Amendment right to petition the government. Southern politicians tried to silence these efforts, fearing the spread of anti-slavery ideas. They passed the gag rule, which blocked discussions of slavery petitions in the House of Representatives. John C. Calhoun and others argued Congress had no power to abolish slavery, even in Washington, D.C., and that receiving petitions did not require action. In practice, petitions were tabled or ignored, especially in the Senate. This rule remained in effect from 1836 to 1844. Former President John Quincy Adams, now a House of Representatives member, fought fiercely against the gag rule in the House. While not a radical abolitionist, he defended the right to petition and cleverly used tactics to challenge the rule. His efforts drew national attention, sparking public debate. Women and free blacks, who were excluded from voting, signed many petitions, increasing their numbers and visibility. The gag rule backfired for the South, generating more public interest in abolition. By 1839, Congress received thousands of petitions with tens of thousands of signatures. signaling the growing power of the anti-slavery movement. After Texas gained independence from Mexico in 1836, Texans eagerly voted to join the United States. But Texas allowed slavery, so Congress resisted annexation, fearing it would upset the balance of power between free and slave states. Talks restarted in 1843 under President John Tyler, but an annexation treaty failed in 1844 due to opposition to slavery. A second attempt succeeded, and Texas became the 28th U.S. state in late 1845, adding another slave state to the Union. Soon after, President James K. Polk was elected and sent troops to claim the Rio Grande River as the U.S.-Mexico border. Mexico claimed the border was at the Nueces River farther north, leading to war. By 1847, American troops were parading in Mexico City. Politicians debated on what to do with Mexican land. Democrats, who supported slavery, wanted to annex large areas to create more slave states. The other major political party, the Whigs, who opposed slavery, wanted no new land. Polk, a Democrat and expansionist, nonetheless pushed for taking land. In 1846, David Wilmot of Pennsylvania proposed banning slavery and any land taken from Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso passed the House but failed in the Senate. Regardless, the proviso set a precedent for any future debates regarding slavery in newly acquired territories. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 ended the war, giving the U.S. nearly half of Mexico's territory, including California, Arizona, and New Mexico. The treaty already made its return on investment when, in January 1848, gold was discovered in California's rivers, sparking the California Gold Rush after President Polk announced it in December. By 1850, nearly 100,000 people had flocked to California, a land where law and order were almost non-existent. This rapid growth led to new debates about how to govern new territories and whether slavery should expand. President Polk suggested extending the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific. Southern congressmen reacted angrily, threatening violence and secession. Alarmed by growing tensions, Southern leaders held a meeting in Nashville, Tennessee, to discuss resisting Northern policies. They wanted to form a union among the Southern states if the North tried to force through their policies. This movement worried many Americans. To ease the crisis, Henry Clay proposed the Compromise of 1850. His plan admitted California as a free state, let New Mexico and Utah decide on slavery for themselves, a concept known as popular sovereignty, settled a border dispute between Texas and New Mexico, abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and created a stricter fugitive slave law. After months of debate, Congress passed the plan as separate laws. The Union is saved, declared some drunken celebrators, but the compromise was only a temporary solution. The deeper conflict over slavery and states' rights remained unsolved. Part 4. Push comes to shove. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that came with the Compromise of 1850 was much harsher than the earlier law from 1793. It obligated all Americans, even those against slavery, to help capture escaped slaves. It also denied accused fugitives the right to a trial, making free black people fear being kidnapped and enslaved. The act encouraged a reverse Underground Railroad, as slave catchers could now be given money as a reward for capturing runaways. Some cities, like Boston and Syracuse, fought back, forcefully rescuing fugitives from authorities. While many northern states tried to avoid major clashes over the law, some passed measures to limit its enforcement. Still, most Northerners, especially conservatives, accepted the law to avoid conflict. The law inspired stronger opposition to slavery. Writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe used their work to expose its cruelty. Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, told the stories of its enslaved characters, like Uncle Tom and Eliza, in a way that readers could not ignore. The book quickly became the most published book in 19th century America, further rallying the North against slavery and strengthening the abolition movement. In 1854, Anthony Burns escaped slavery in Virginia and fled to Boston, where he worked in a clothing store. He decided to send a letter to his brother, who was still enslaved, and Burns' former owner intercepted it. Federal officers tracked down and arrested Burns, sparking outrage in Boston. Abolitionists tried to storm the courthouse and free him, but failed. President Franklin Pierce sent soldiers to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, forcing Burns back into slavery despite protests. At the same time as the Burns debacle, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in May. This law gave settlers in Kansas and Nebraska popular sovereignty, but this made the Missouri Compromise, which had banned slavery there, useless. Stephen A. Douglas, an Illinois congressman, wrote the act to encourage westward settlement and build a transcontinental railroad through the territories, but many opposed it. Northerners, especially abolitionists and free soilers, the latter wanting to prevent the expansion of slavery, saw the act as a betrayal. They called it a crime and organized protests through speeches, petitions, and meetings. Northern newspapers and legislatures also condemned it. The act split the Whig Party, which had found itself divided over the issue of slavery. The Whig Party's anti-slavery members and the Free Soilers combined and formed the Republican Party, which ultimately sought to oppose slavery's spread. The South looked for other areas to expand slavery, and their political power as well. Throughout the 1840s, the U.S. wanted to buy Cuba. Spain, which owned Cuba, refused to sell. Determined Southerners supported adventurers, called filibusters, who tried to take Cuba by force. Narciso Lopez led these efforts in 1851, but his poorly planned expeditions failed. Despite this, Southern towns praised him as a hero. The idea of taking Cuba faded until President Pierce took office in 1853. Although Spain still refused to sell, Pierce quietly backed another filibuster attempt. However, Pierce's Democrats had spent most of their money on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, so the plan had to be cancelled. At the same time, U.S. diplomats met in Ostend, Belgium, and wrote the Ostend Manifesto. This document claimed America had the right to seize Cuba if Spain refused to sell. When the manifesto accidentally became public, it caused outrage, especially among anti-slavery groups. Facing criticism, Pierce forever abandoned his plans for Cuba. At the same time, war was brewing in Kansas. As mentioned before, the Kansas-Nebraska Act let settlers decide if slavery would be allowed, but instead of solving the issue, it led to violence. People from the North and the South rushed to Kansas to sway the decision, hoping to make it either a free or slave state. Eli Thayer from Massachusetts was the first to organize a group to help anti-slavery, or Free Stater, settlers move to Kansas. Pro-slavery Missourians, worried about losing influence, moved there too. The Missourians crossed into Kansas illegally to vote in elections, securing pro-slavery outcomes. Kansas's first governor, Andrew Reeder, let the fraudulent results stand, angering anti-slavery settlers. These settlers formed a rival government in Lawrence. Both sides prepared for conflict. In late 1855, violence broke out. A pro-slavery man killed his anti-slavery neighbor in a land dispute, sparking revenge attacks. Missourian border ruffians then surrounded Lawrence, though no major violence broke out. In May 1856, tensions exploded. When Sheriff Samuel Jones was unable to arrest some Free Staters in Lawrence, he returned with a posse and sacked the town, destroying printing presses and burning buildings like the Free State Hotel. The next day, in Washington, Senator Charles Sumner delivered a fiery anti-slavery speech regarding the events in Kansas, insulting some of Representative Preston Brooks' family members in the process. Brooks then took his cane and bashed Sumner to within an inch of his life. The attack shocked the nation and showed just how divided it was. The caning of Sumner pushed abolitionist John Brown over the edge. He gathered some followers, including his sons, and proceeded to butcher 5 pro-slavery settlers at Potawatomi Creek in Kansas. Both sides now believed civil war was inevitable, and over the summer, armed groups fought and destroyed property across Kansas. By fall, the newly appointed Governor John Gary restored some order by promising fairness to both sides, but the political divide stayed strong. In 1857, Kansas's pro-slavery government submitted a state constitution that enshrined slavery, but Free Staters were able to strike it down twice. Despite this, President James Buchanan insisted Kansas be admitted under the proposed constitution. As a result, the reputation of the Democrats suffered, while the Republican cause strengthened. Dred Scott was a slave owned by John Emerson, an army doctor. During the 1830s, Scott lived in both free and slave states as Emerson was posted from place to place. While in Minnesota, where slavery was illegal, Scott got married and became a father. When Emerson died, his widow kept Scott and his family enslaved. In 1846, Scott's friends encouraged him to sue for his freedom, arguing that he had lived in free states for a long time. The case took 11 years, starting in local courts but becoming a national issue. In 1850, Scott won freedom in the Missouri court, but the state's Supreme Court reversed the decision in 1852 under pro-slavery pressure. His case then moved to federal courts and finally to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1856. In 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled against Scott. The court, which was mostly pro-slavery, said Scott was not a U.S. citizen and could not sue in federal court. Taney also declared that Congress could not ban slavery in any territory, making the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. The ruling angered many. Republicans warned it could spread slavery everywhere. Abraham Lincoln, a newly nominated Republican congressman from Illinois, believed Democrats and the Supreme Court wanted to allow slavery even in free states. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," said Lincoln, quoting Jesus in his nomination speech. "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it, and place it where in the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward, till it shall become lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." Part 5. Disunion. Among the people Lincoln believed were conspiring to expand slavery was Stephen A. Douglas, the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas angered Southern Democrats because, due to his principle of popular sovereignty, Kansas had the chance to become a free state. Douglas defended this principle, even after the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, which threatened it. In 1858, Lincoln challenged Douglas in a heated re-election race for Illinois' seat in the U.S. Senate. In a series of debates, they argued over slavery's future, drawing huge crowds. Lincoln argued slavery was morally wrong and should not expand. He warned that its growth would harm the country, and urged voters to support Republicans who opposed it. Douglas accused Lincoln of wanting racial equality, and mocked him for believing black people were equal under the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln denied pushing for full equality, but insisted black people deserved freedom and the right to their labor. In the end, Douglas won the election, but the debates made Lincoln a national figure and energized the Republican Party. After his time in Kansas, John Brown traveled across America to raise money for the Free Staters. He developed a plan to start a massive slave rebellion by leading armed groups through the Appalachian Mountains. In 1858, Brown met with black and white supporters in Canada. They created a plan for a new nation of freed slaves, with Brown as its leader. When he returned to the U.S., he began gathering weapons in a small group of followers. Brown aimed to seize weapons from the U.S. Armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. He hoped to rally enslaved people and use the momentum to free more as he moved south. In October 1859, he attacked the armory with 21 men, including 5 black recruits. However, the plan failed. Few enslaved people joined, and local militias surrounded the group. Brown and his men held out in a small firehouse until the U.S. Marines, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, captured them. Brown was wounded and later tried for treason. On December 2, 1859, he was hanged. His death made him a martyr for the abolitionist cause and a hero in the North. His bold but doomed rebellion was a tragic prelude to what was to come. The 1860 presidential election divided the United States. In the North, it was Abraham Lincoln against Stephen Douglas. In the South, it was John Breckinridge against John Bell. Lincoln and the Republican Party could not even campaign in 10 southern states due to threats of violence. The Republicans focused on the issues like tariffs and free land for settlers, avoiding direct talk of slavery in some areas to reduce backlash. Douglas, despite poor health, traveled across the country, trying to unite voters. However, he faced attacks from both factions of the Democratic Party and won only 12% of the Southern vote. Scandals under President Buchanan weakened the Democrats, and Republicans used these scandals to expose corruption. Lincoln's potential victory alarmed many Southerners because his party opposed slavery. Southern politicians and newspapers warned that his win would bring disaster. Lincoln refused to calm Southern fears, believing that his promises that he would not interfere with slavery were enough. The North largely dismissed Southern warnings as exaggerated. On November 6th, Lincoln won decisively, especially in the northern states. His election was a turning point. Northern anti-slavery supporters saw it as a triumph over Southern control, while Southern leaders viewed it as a threat to their economy, society, and way of life, all of which revolved around slavery. To them, something had to change. In December, South Carolina's politicians held a convention and voted to leave the Union. By February 1861, 6 more Southern states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, had also voted to secede. These states wanted to protect slavery, fearing the new Republican government threatened their property and right to own slaves. Many compared their actions to the American Revolution, saying that they were fighting for freedom from a hostile government. Southern leaders used racial arguments to gain support from non-slaveholding whites. For example, Georgia's governor, Joseph Brown, claimed slavery protected poor white workers from being seen as equal to black people. Others feared that abolishing slavery would lead to racial equality and disrupt the South's social system. Congress tried to stop the breakup with compromises like the Crittenden Plan, which suggested constitutionally protecting slavery in some areas. While some Republicans backed it to avoid economic trouble, Lincoln and others opposed it. They refused to allow slavery to expand, seeing it as a betrayal of their election promises. In February 1861, leaders of the seceding states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and created the Confederate Constitution, which was not too different from the U.S. Constitution, except it explicitly protected slavery. They chose Jefferson Davis, a man with experience as a military and political leader, as President of the Confederate States of America. Meanwhile, they began seizing federal forts and arsenals to prepare for conflict. One of these forts was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a strong brick fort on an island at Charleston Harbor's entrance. It could hold 650 soldiers and over 140 cannons, but in December, it was nearly empty because it had not finished construction. Nearby, 80 U.S. soldiers stayed at Fort Moultrie, a weaker and outdated fort. The freshly seceded South Carolina wanted control of all federal property, including these forts. Armed groups in Charleston threatened violence if the federal troops did not leave. Major Robert Anderson, a Union officer from Kentucky, led these soldiers. Fearing an attack, he secretly moved his men to Fort Sumter on December 26. In January, an outgoing President Buchanan sent supplies on a ship called Star of the West, but South Carolina forces fired on it, forcing it to retreat. Anderson held his fire, trying to avoid war. By March 1861, Fort Sumter was running low on supplies. A newly inaugurated Lincoln decided to send another ship. He told South Carolina that the ship only had food and no weapons or soldiers at all. Nonetheless, Confederate leaders saw it as a threat. On April 12th, Confederate forces, led by General P.G.T. Beauregard, bombarded the fort for 33 hours. The Union troops surrendered on April 14th. As Lincoln called for 75,000 new militia volunteers the next day, it became clear that the United States was now in a state of civil war.